Oh, lovely. We've heard about the recording, so now I can introduce myself. So hi, I'm Poppy Maltby, the head of local energy at Regen. I'm going to be chairing the session today, but I am going to wait a few moments for a few more people to join us before we kick off. In the meantime, do feel free to say hello to us in the chat function before we start our session. So I'll just give it one more moment and then we'll start. Okay. I think we're starting to level off on numbers, but welcome everybody to our session today on the revival of onshore wind in England. My name's Poppy Maltby. I'm the head of local energy at Regen, and I'm going to be chairing the session today. For those that don't know us, Regen, we are a not-for-profit independent energy experts, and we work on our mission to accelerate the shift to net zero energy system. So for us, that really means working on the enablers of that shift. So particularly the networks, the markets and planning regimes that can make all of this happen. We're a membership organisation, so if you're interested to find out more about that, please do contact my colleague Hannah Stanley, who sent you the details for today. So we are ticking up still in numbers, but we've got a lot to cover. So I am going to kick us off today, and it's really great to see so many people here. I'm hoping there might be some in the audience who can remember the last session that Regen ran on onshore wind, which was in April 2022. It was an optimistically titled Onshore Wind, a Renaissance ? When we convened following a small tweak to the wording on the now infamous planning footnote. It turned out that didn't achieve very much, but the good news is today we're in a much better place, and the footnotes are a bit of a distant memory. So onshore wind, as we've seen in the Clean Power 2030, onshore wind is once again in the spotlight as the cheapest source of renewable energy. And the 2030 targets have an ambitious near doubling of capacity from onshore, from around 14 to 27 gigawatts. The good news is it's much quicker to build than offshore wind, and we already have a really significant pipeline, more so in Scotland and Wales, of course, than England. But those barriers remain, especially related to grid and planning. So we're going to be exploring today what's needed to for onshore wind to thrive again in England. We've got some much larger and more efficient turbines than when we were building 10 years ago, but these can also create planning barriers, both for new projects and repowering. And we're also going to discuss about what meaningful community engagement looks like and the opportunities for things like shared ownership, community benefits, and how these things can support successful projects. So our agenda today, we're going to be starting with Joe Penrose, the head of onshore wind at DESNZ. He's going to be talking to us about the Onshore Wind Taskforce and their role in looking at some of these barriers. We're then going to hear about the current state of the wind energy market in the UK from Paul Evans at Waldor Armstrong and Harriet Murray-Jones from Bevan, Britain. We've also got Ian Shaw from Keele University on hand to answer some questions about their project. So following that, we're going to go to a panel session with our speakers. And additionally, we've got Eri Davies, head of onshore development for Wales and England from RWE, and our very own Rebecca Windermere, the planning and communities lead at Regen. So finally, before we start, some quick logistics. We're running this as a webinar, which means to talk to us, and we would really like you to talk to us, please do use the Q&A and chat functions. We're going to be having short sessions for questions after each of the speaking slots, as well as during the longer panel. So there's a lot of opportunity to get those questions in front of our experts. So in the Q&A function, you're going to be able to pose questions. You're also going to be able to upvote other people's questions. Please do this because it actually makes my job so much easier if the popular questions sort of float up to the top of that list. There's also a chat for general discussion. So hopes and dreams for wind power, how windy it is, in your area, etc., please do post that in the chat. And we've got some great speakers and panelists today, so do make a full use of their knowledge. I think that's me done with the introduction, so I'm going to hand over now to Joe.
Yep, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I thought I might start with a little bit of context and then talk a bit about the Onshore Wind Industry Taskforce and what it's trying to achieve in that context. So, as Poppy mentioned, we've got 14 gigawatts of onshore wind in Great Britain today, but to meet our ambitious goal of decarbonising the power sector by 2030, we know that we're going to need a decent amount more. The exact amount of this that we need will obviously be dependent on increase in demand due to the rate of electrification in other sectors, and actually the delivery or non-delivery of other technology options in power. The NESO Clean Power Report indicated that could be around 27 gigawatts, but it also said that onshore wind might be required to pick up the slack as a result of that delivery or non-delivery in other sectors, and or as a result of rate of increases in in demand. Now, by applying attrition rates to known projects in the pipeline today, we think that we could get as little as 24 gigawatts by 2030. And actually, due to the historic ban in England and grid constraints in Wales, 90% of the pipeline is currently in Scotland. And this brings additional issues in relation to cumulative constraints, and those attrition rates might even grow, potentially exacerbating the risk of non-delivery. So how do we bridge this gap between that NESO estimate of 27 gigawatts and, you know, that kind of lower end of future deployment trajectories? And that is the kind of the key conundrum that we need to look at, particularly in light of the removal of the ban in England. Now, because of that ban in England, there is a kind of limited, or you could even argue, non-existent pipeline. And with onshore wind development timelines taking, you know, from inception through to operation, anywhere between kind of 4 and 9 years, you know, this is it leaves us with a very little amount of time to be able to secure any additionality from England to help us bridge that gap. And this is basically the exam question of the Onshore Wind Industry Taskforce, which has been set up. How do we build a pipeline, and how do we then accelerate that pipeline to secure that additionality? However, you know, some of the levers that government and others will need to pull in order to kind of answer that question, you know, are reserved. And we have to be mindful of this, and the task force is. In that respect, we've also got the opportunity to de-risk the existing pipeline in Scotland and Wales. So in this aspect, the task force is somewhat multi-territorial, framed in that exam question about England, but also, you know, we're very mindful of the fact that we can also, you know, reduce that attrition rate in Scotland, or increase the amount of projects that can connect to the grid in Wales. So the task force itself, this was announced by Ed Miliband in July, and it had its first meeting on the 31st of July. It's comprised of an executive committee. So this is kind of 20 or so senior bods from industry, developers, large and small, some trade unions, some supply chain companies, community energy representative on there, and some of the senior civil servants from the devolved administrations. And this executive committee is underpinned by 6 advisory forums or subgroups that broadly correlate with the key themes or challenges associated with accelerated onshore wind deployment. These are kind of site scoping, planning and environmental consenting is one, grids and networks, communities and public perception, aviation and defence, finances and routes to market, and supply chains and skills. And in each of those working groups, we've got about kind of 50 to 60 individuals. So in total, over 250 individuals across all 6, serious depth and breadth of expertise across there. And the executive committee and the advisory forums are designed to work in a bit of iterative process of commissions and recommendations based around kind of 3 key objectives. One of these is naturally, you know, removing the barriers that onshore wind developers face to development. You know, this is not just kind of barriers to investing in new projects, but also kind of ensuring that those projects can move through the process of development faster and at lower cost. But that's not the only thing we need to do. one of those objectives is about ensuring sustainability, generally managing and controlling the impacts that onshore wind projects can have on communities, but also on other land space users or even airspace users, and making sure that development is mindful of that kind of longer term approach, and that when we do build onshore wind, it's done to kind of best practice, best standards. And then the final one of these objectives is about capturing the benefits. If we're going to be doubling onshore wind, that comes with a huge amount of opportunities. How can we drive investment into the local communities that are hosting these sites? And also, how can we secure improvements in jobs and skills and GVA at a national scale as well? At the end of this iterative process, after about kind of 6 to 8 months, the task force will be publishing a formal report or a policy statement or a roadmap, call it what you want. And that will articulate the key challenges, some of the ambitions that we want for 2030, and make a series of commitments to action, to policy interventions, which we will then need to undertake if we're going to achieve those 2030 goals. Where are we in the process? Phase 1 was concluded in September. In that first phase, that was the kind of scoping phase. We threw everyone in a room together in these 6 advisory forums and got them kind of chatting about what are the main barriers, what are our ambitions, and what are the potential policy interventions we could make here. And each of those groups pulled together an initial scoping statement, which articulated the key problem statements, the key ambitions and goals, and a pretty long list for each of those of possible policy interventions or actions that could be taken in order to kind of mitigate those problem statements, ensure those sustainability ambitions, or capture those benefits. The executive committee then met, reviewed those statements and said, these look good, but we need you to go away and collect some evidence. We need to kind of qualify and quantify those problem statements, and these lists are too long. You need to make sure that you're prioritizing those. And then we progressed to phase 2, which was the evidence gathering and data collection phase of the task force. A series of questionnaires were sent out to each of those working groups, asking for quantitative information on costs, timelines, and other bits and bobs. Qualitative information, case studies, kind of comment on challenges, and ask those working groups to rate the long list of policy interventions by order of importance. We will then be progressing to phase 3 shortly. The executive committee will be reviewing those. Based on all that information, we will be kind of providing that back to the executive committee, and they will be kind of selecting which policies need to be taken forward for design, which policies can be discounted. And then we progress to phase 3, and that is kind of policy design. We'll be hosting a series of deep dives on those potential policy options to establish the rationale, ownership, timelines to delivery, impacts, and other aspects to do with the kind of management of those. And then design and finalization of that formal report will follow. Phase 4 will be publication of that report. And then after that, the task force, as is often the case with these, the belief I often find is that once you've done that, you've completed it, which is far from the case. All we've done is identify what we think the right interventions are, then we will need to go ahead and deliver them. And that will in itself be a challenge. It's likely that the task force will progress in perhaps a slightly different form into the kind of 5th phase, which is the monitoring and implementation of those policy interventions, and of course considering other ones as they crop up. So that's where we are at the moment. I might pause there. I think that's my allotted 10 minutes, and then I think we've got some time for questions.
Yes. Thank you, Joe. That's a good outline of the process so far. Can you give us any sneak previews of what has floated to the top at the moment? We've got a question, for example, about the planning regimes and the planning reform. Can you allude to whether that's quite high up the list?
Absolutely. Every one of those areas is important. So on the planning side of things, there are a number of things. Removing the planning ban is one thing. You will have also noticed that the MHCLG have consulted on a kind of increased weight in favour of renewables. So that goes a little bit of an extra step and provides that clarity to planners as to how to consider onshore wind projects as they come through. But there's many more things we need to do in that space. You know, one of the key barriers is that without a kind of substantial onshore wind project passing through the planning system for almost a decade, maybe longer, there are some doubts about how these will be treated. So it's really important that we are updating guidance, and that goes from the NPPF, which is under consultation, updating planning practice guidance. We're going to need to introduce a national policy statement for onshore wind, given that we're consulting on reintroducing it into the development consent order regime. And there's also another suite of kind of guidance documents that exist within the planning system related to everything from impacts on landscape and visual impacts to whatever it may be, impacts on heritage. And we need to also kind of rationalize those and standardize those. But on top of that, there also needs to be kind of clear guidance and training and resource provided to local planning authorities. So that's also very much at the top of our list. And naturally, we'll need to kind of work out what that looks like in practice, which will probably come as part of the design phase. So I think they're probably the main interventions. But I'm sure others will crop up on the planning side as we go along. Yeah.
We've had a couple of questions asking for a bit more of a sneak preview and what floated to the top of that list. Other than planning, what are the other sort of big three that are?
Well, there's all six. So
all six.
Well, I suppose on the planning side as well, there's the kind of point around environmental consenting and maybe some work that needs to be done there to improve the information that's collected and disseminated in that space. So that's also in there. On grids and networks, the main concerns, I think, are around connection timelines and costs associated with that and changes to those. And of course, transmission network use of system charges, less of an issue for England, in fact, and possibly even kind of weights development in favour of England. But nevertheless, it's still, that's a substantial risk to the cost of the 2030 pipeline. And I believe that Ofgem are working on something in that realm. I'm not hugely across that, but there's clearly been a signal that needs to be addressed. So they're the kind of main two aspects in the grid side. What else is there? Communities and public perception. For that, I suppose it's a number of things, but it's improving engagement. I actually think engagement is done quite well between onshore wind developers and communities. So there's something in that space around kind of looking at our engagement guidance and our best practice engagement guidance and really bringing that to the forefront. We published something in 2021, and we may need to kind of look at that and just formalize that and its relationship with the kind of development life cycle. At the moment, it sits on a bit of a kind of gov.uk page island. So there's maybe something about bringing that to the forefront. On community benefits, we committed some time ago and still will to publishing an updated community benefits protocol for onshore wind in England. That's in train, and we're hoping that will be published sometime, potentially in the new year. And then there's quite a lot of interventions for us to look at in relation to kind of local and community energy, Poppy, which I'm sure you'll be across. And that actually sits across a range of things, planning and permitted development rights, and actually how community energy projects full stop are treated in planning. There's, financial support as well. So that's cropped up. On the aviation and defence side, both looking at trying to improve transparency in the process of signing radar mitigation scheme agreements with aviation stakeholders and working with the Ministry of Defence to improve processes in relation to interference with seismic monitoring, which is a South of Scotland issue, but with some parts of development in the north of England likely to be impacted by that, and radar interference. So there's quite a lot of work happening in that space. On finances and routes to market, it's mainly contracts for different scheme and how can that be improved. My colleagues who work in the contracts for different scheme keep it under kind of a constant flow of reform there's a consultation every 6 months, as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware. So we're making sure that the suggestions and the concerns of the Onshore Wind Industry Taskforce subgroup in relation to finances and routes to market are being fed into there. And there's also lots of suggestions that have been thrown up in terms of support for small scale energy projects, which we are keeping under review, but they're quite complex, and policy design takes time. And then finally, in supply chains, it's an interesting one. I think this is probably the biggest intelligence gap for government. And we do have last mover disadvantage compared to our European counterparts in the manufacture of major components. Nevertheless, there are kind of three key things there. One, which is interventions to alleviate potential constraints in the supply chain. One of the kind of areas that's been identified is freight of turbine components to sites, particularly the escorting of abnormal loads, and we're looking very carefully at a solution in that space. There's also that, what can we do, if anything, to increase UK content in the manufacture of major components? Tricky question, but more work looking at that. Is there something that we can do in the O&M sector? Is there something about assembly of parts? Can we do something with ports? Again, a lot of areas that need further development. And then potentially something on kind of recycling, reuse, and the circular economy. This was something that was identified through the Scottish sector deal. We're very much trying to keep links open there, and possibly collaborating with our Scottish counterparts on something in that space. They're the ones off the top of my head, but there's a lot more. I think the initial exercise threw up something in the region of kind of 60 to 100 policy interventions. We need to whittle them down to maybe 30 tops, to make sure that we're being really focused. I think if you get 60 to 100, you deliver maybe 2. There's only so many hours in the day, so we need to make sure that we're focusing on the top ones and really plucking the low-hanging fruit first.
No, that's a really great overview. Thank you, Joe. Is there how do people learn a bit more about what the task force are doing? Is there something online they can?
If you Google the Onshore Wind Industry Taskforce, we've got a web page. The terms of reference are in there, and that will kind of set out the structure of the task force, who sits on it, and what we're trying to achieve. And the minutes of the task force meetings are also published on there. And there'll be others, I'm sure, that are on this call that are in there. So yeah.
Great. I just, final question before we go over, was around the link between, I guess, what you're doing and the sort of bigger targets, the CP 2030, the SSE, the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, and things like. How is that working from your perspective? And like,
yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting point. I mean, so the kind of Clean Power 2030 work, there's quite a lot of things happening in that space. And government will be kind of signalling its response to NESO's Clean Power report shortly, and that will kind of set a kind of broad scope for what is considered to be mission critical for 2030. And actually, the Onshore Wind Industry Taskforce publication will almost hang from that. There'll be a lot of callbacks to government's response. And we're collaborating really closely with the team there. Naturally, having an extra kind of 3 or 4 months for our publication allows us to go into a bit more detail, take some of the policy steps from that kind of mission critical approach and really drill down into them and make them onshore wind specific. But we're also mindful that a kind of focus on 2030 can carry the risk, shall we say, of discounting impactful policies just because they won't apply 2030, or it's not as clear that they will apply 2030. For instance, on the supply chain is a prime example of where actually limiting ourselves to a 2030 timeframe perhaps is less helpful, and maybe we should be looking more at the 2035 horizon there, and that's when the kind of carbon budget 6 kicks in as well. So there's additional considerations in respect of that. So very much 2030 focus for the Onshore Wind Industry Taskforce, and we'll hang on that kind of clean power work. But naturally, we've got the scope to go a little bit more beyond, be a little bit more nuanced, be a little bit more kind of considerate of that longer term horizon, and make sure that we're planning for that as well. In terms of the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, very much linked in with that team. Again, that's a 2030, 2035 horizon, and considering how we can kind of plug some of those recommendations in. And we're very acutely aware that with so much happening in this space, it can be quite difficult to navigate how one thing links into the other. But equally, it presents us with a really great opportunity here, in that we're having these conversations to be able to then go to those kind of broader reform programs and say, we've identified this, we've collected all this evidence and data, we think this is appropriate, and make sure that as those broader reforms develop, they are cognizant of and reflect the concerns and ambitions of the onshore wind sector. So it can seem a little bit complicated, but I actually think it's working extremely well.
Yeah, it sounds there's an awful lot of momentum, essentially, and that a lot of things are happening now as well as planning for the future. It's just good to know it's not just sort of waiting for the outputs of the task force. It sounds like there's a lot going on already. So thank you so much, Joe. You're going to be joining us for the panel, so there's more opportunity to ask questions a bit later on. But now I'm going to hand over to Paul and Harriet to hear a bit more about the current state of the market and some real life examples.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I was struggling to get my video to enable then. Hello, yeah, I'm Paul Evans. I'm Head of Energy and Climate Change at Wardell Armstrong, which is now part of the SLR group. And I'm with Harriet, and we're going to go through a little bit on, the current state of the market in England as part of this presentation. I'm just going to start off with a bit of a talk about how the wind industry has changed. So for those of you who haven't been involved in wind in the past 10 years in England, because obviously it hasn't been happening, there have been a fair few changes sort of in the markets and in turbine scales and that sort of thing. On the plus side, as we've heard about, there's still plenty happening in Scotland and Wales. So the supply chain hasn't collapsed. We've still got plenty of suppliers available. There's still lots happening, that there are still consultants available in the market, we can still make things work. But what has changed is turbine sizes have increased dramatically. Lots and lots of the turbines in England were installed around sort of the feed-in tariff time. So we've got lots of relatively small turbines currently. And lots of those just simply aren't available in the market anymore. We're sort of down to, I think, 3 manufacturers of turbines up to about 1 megawatt. And what's happened is effectively bigger turbines are cheaper turbines. And as those rotor diameters get bigger, the cost per megawatt installed can come down. And obviously the energy generation goes up. So we're seeing bigger and bigger turbines, and that will have some interesting implications, I think, when it comes to sort of reinvigorating the market in England in particular. Sort of the bigger wind farms were sort of all around the 2 megawatt class, I would say. Towards the end, when we started to see projects being pickled and being overturned by the Secretary of State, 2 to 3 megawatts was sort of common at that point. But the projects we're now seeing developed in Scotland in particular, and to some extent Wales, but mainly Scotland, they're all in the 5 megawatt plus category. So we're looking at turbines that are 150 meters plus to tip, with rotor diameters exceeding 130 meters in some cases. That's up from 80, 90 meters previously. So they are generally getting much bigger. So, what will that mean for smaller sites in England? England generally has smaller field sizes. We generally have a high density of housing, so noise issues are slightly more pronounced. We've got requirements from Natural England that blade tips need to be 50 meters from hedgerows. So there are potentially some issues there in terms of fitting things in. And then obviously, again, the strong protection of heritage assets and the setting of heritage assets also has meant that perhaps smaller turbines have been favoured in England. So we need to think about how we can make larger turbines work, I think, in the English context, the same way that we've managed in Scotland and Wales. The other thing to consider, I think, as part of that is repowering projects. They'll have similar issues. We've worked on a couple of repowering projects ourselves. And again, once you look at the constraints that the site was under initially when it was when turbines were installed, those constraint buffers will be considerably greater, I think, for bigger turbines. So we do really need to consider that, and that comes back to what we just heard from Joe as well. Sort of aviation impacts to radar. All those sorts of issues may be different with larger turbines. So it's just something to keep in mind. On the plus side, of course, the bigger turbines are cheaper per megawatt. So that's great news. And also, just as a quick comparison, I know quite a few of you are probably working or have been involved to some extent with PV, because that's what has been a success story over the last 10 years. So just a couple of quick comparisons, really. So this is on average, obviously every site is specific, but on average, a megawatt of wind power will produce roughly 3 times more electricity than 1 megawatt of solar PV over the course of a year. And for that 1 megawatt, you'll probably for that 1 megawatt of wind, you'll probably spend 30 to 40% more for each megawatt of installed capacity. So per unit, it is cheaper, but development costs can be much higher. There's more issues to consider. And the other thing I just wanted to flag sort of at the end of this section is there is definitely the potential to co-locate wind and PV. And we've had quite a few success stories with this, where we're actually co-locating wind and PV within the same grid connection envelope. So the generation profiles are quite complementary. In general, it's not so windy when it's sunny, vice versa. So we have actually had some success of co-locating projects, and that's perhaps something we can look to more in the future as well in the English context. Harriet.
Hi, thank you, Paul. So my name's Harriet. I'm an energy lawyer. I've worked in renewable energy for about 20 years. I haven't done quite so much wind in the last 10 years, but you'll be pleased to know you don't have too much of the lawyer here today. And actually what's really important, I think, is what we're hearing about, which is the renewed focus on planning and grid, which are the real constraints. So it's really great to hear from Joe today, actually. So what am I seeing? I think I'm seeing enthusiasm, but some nervousness. And I think that's, lots of clients are looking at it, people are starting to think about it, but they're definitely a bit nervous. So one key thing I want to talk to you about really today is what are the legal differences in relation to wind as opposed to the projects we've been seeing a lot of over the last 10 years. And actually, those are probably fairly limited in truth. The rights are going to vary for what you need for a wind turbine project, whether it's singular or multiple are going to be different. You need to reflect the different technology and how that's being constructed. You're going to have probably a smaller lease footprint, but you're probably going to have lots of connected footprints with easements in between them. So the documents are going to have to reflect the various accesses and the easements. But really, you are talking about the same thing that we're all quite familiar with over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Minerals and trespass probably even more important on wind than they have been on solar. And of course, oversailing, it really is quite an important factor here, particularly if you consider how much the turbines have changed in the last few years. They are much, much bigger. So the oversailing and the rights and the extent of the blades of the turbines themselves bring into consideration, as Paul said, as to siting and neighbours. And in addition to your easements between your site, you need to think about access. And I noticed Joe mentioning escorts, and really glad to hear DenZed focusing on this. There was a recent blade brought in close by to where I live in Wales, and it actually made the national news. It was so exciting that this turbine was coming along the road. And you will need rights simply to bring in and decommission the turbines. So that consideration is really important, actually. In a way, while the legal documents are similar, they have to reflect a totally different set of practical parameters. And I think the other thing that really we need to think about is, I know that clients now are starting to look at upgrading existing projects and repowering, and that brings into whether what you've got at the moment actually works legally for a much bigger turbine, whether the permitted rights are good enough, or indeed whether the extent of the footprint is big enough. But really, it's a set of practical issues to be reflected in a situation that we're all quite familiar with. I'm going to very briefly touch on planning constraints, because we've heard from Joe about the government's doubling of onshore wind, and we've got a panel coming up. But I think my point on this really is that we wait to see how practically this ambition is going to be achieved, not just by the planning and the committees themselves, but all the consultees who need to be engaged in this system. And it was good to hear Joe talking about streamlining and what we can do to get this moving better, to get the onshore wind on the same footing as other energy developments in the national policy would be really important. Mordell Armstrong will tell us that this almost certainly isn't a problem, but I think there is a reminder of how we need to do these projects. Some of them haven't been done for really quite a long time in England. Although we'll hear from Kiel, who have indeed got their project through. So I think that was really all I wanted to say on planning constraints, because I think we'll talk about that, and everybody's very aware of what we're saying there. So I think in terms of barriers to development, I think what I would add to what we've heard from Joe on those barriers is a willingness. There's definitely some nervousness about taking on onshore wind, and I think the focus that we're seeing will really help with that. We all know about planning and grid, and the new government agenda will hopefully also focus on this. I think finance is a bit of a barrier at the moment. There's investment in renewables there's a lot of money about, but it takes a very long time, and obviously that's quite tricky if you're looking to finance it. And then I think the main barrier is what we all know, NIMBYism and the press, and we need to change the narrative, but I think that is starting to happen. Paul's already mentioned it. There's a bit of an issue about space in England. We've got small fields, we've got hedgerows, and while the individual footprints, as I've mentioned, are small, you've got to keep space around them practically, but they can be built on farms that can keep growing crops and grazing animals, and you can do co-location. So I think in the main, I would say the current state is probably nervously optimistic and definitely moving in the right direction. So Paul, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you. So yeah, just to finish up this section, I just thought I'd do a quick summary of a case study. So we worked with Keele University from 2019 till I think 2022. I think we finished up from our point of view, where we consented 2 wind turbines, a PV array, and a BESS system. The environmental work and feasibility started in 2019, and then we consented that in planning in 2020, and we had it pretty much built and operating 2022, so quite a short time scale. The project was interesting, it was challenging. Obviously, that was during the period where onshore wind was, in theory, banned, but I just thought I'd talk about some of the constraints and how we got past them in the end. So Keele University were developing something called the Smart Energy Network Demonstrator, which is a fantastic project looking at basically using their own private grid to allow technologies to come onto that network and test and see how they work in a modern system. And as part of that, they wanted to have their own renewable energy generators as diverse as possible. So they wanted PV and wind, and also a BESS as well, so they could do some grid management as part of that. So we commenced that, like I say, in 2017, construction being complete in 2021. And consent was, I mean, there were lots of issues at planning, and don't get me wrong, there was lots that needed to be dealt with. But we did get consent, and it wasn't called in by the Secretary of State. I think that's probably key. The main reason for that may have been we got the permission from the local authority at almost exactly the same time as Boris Johnson's tenure as Prime Minister came to an end. And it may well be the government were distracted by other things, but for one reason or another, it wasn't called in. But there was a fair amount of work we needed to do to get the consent. And one of the key things was heritage. you'd like to go to the next slide. So there's a few slides here where I'll just skip to just visually show some of the heritage issues. So the site is within a registered park and garden, also a conservation area, and also a Grade 2 listed building, of which is Keel Hall. So as part of that, we effectively had to ultimately design the parks or design the wind farm so the turbines were pretty much not visible from Keel Hall. We also had to minimise the impacts on the park and garden. And as part of that, so we ended up reducing the turbine size down from 2 megawatts down to about 1 megawatt. And those turbines actually wouldn't be available now, going back to my previous slides. So what you can see here is those purple areas are effectively the only areas on the land we could put the turbines, where they would be not visible from the front of Keel Hall. We also had some objections from the MOD on radar as well, which meant the turbines had to be kept relatively short. But we dealt with all that. We managed to finally get it signed off by English Heritage, passed it through. And then I think finally, next slide, have we got? Yep, we managed to get it all built, and that's a picture of the site operational as it is now. Obviously, any questions on this, we're happy to answer them as we go through. But I think it's a really good case study, of what, despite the ban as it was, I think it is possible, or was possible, to get sites through the planning system as long as they were designed carefully, the constraints dealt with, and in particular, in this case, I think we ended up with very few objections from the public. I think we ended up with only 3 public objections, which is quite exceptional, I would say.
Yeah, that's great, Paul. And it's good to see that something got through. But like you were flagging the size of the turbines is definitely a big question, I think, for England, and I imagine that's come up in the task force. So if anyone has any sort of technical questions about the Keel example, then please put them in the chat. Ian and Paul will do their best to answer them. I don't think we've got much time for questions because we're about to move to the panel. But I did just have one quick one because it's an area that I'm interested in, is the fact that it was a joint site for solar, wind and battery. What were the sort of benefits or challenges to trying to do that together?
I'd say in general, I think it created a bit of a challenge. We actually ended up doing 2 planning applications and 2 environmental impact assessments because there was so much concern that the wind would get refused or get called in by the Secretary of State. So as part of that, Keel actually ended up spending quite a lot more money on the development process and dividing the whole thing into 2 to try and mitigate that risk. And actually,
would that not be needed so much now, or would that be a different situation?
Yeah, you would hope that you'd be able to do it as one, and certainly that would reduce costs considerably. There was 2 sets of planning fees. 2 sets of EIA documents had to be produced. Had to attend 2 planning committees even, and actually even then the solar was consented quite a lot more quickly than the wind. So there's a bit of a delay between the 2 consents.
Lovely. Thank you all. Thank you, Ian. Did you want to just say hello quickly? You're on mute.
Try that's it. Just the Onshore Wind Operations and Engineering Manager. One thing probably not picked up in that report is the DNO and getting a connection to the site, which took 2 years. So if anybody wants to ask any questions about that, we are well founded in how to deal with DNOs.
Good to know. Lovely, thank you all. We're going to move on to our panel session now. So we have Joe back, and we've also got Harriet and Paul staying on, but we've got 2 new additional members to our panel. We've got Larry and Rebecca, and I'm going to ask you both to introduce yourselves and give us a quick 2-minute pitch on what you think needs to happen to support this revival of onshore wind. Should I go to Larry first?
you. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess, yeah, other speakers have already covered a lot of the points around England, but I guess I'll look at it from the perspective of being on that Onshore Wind Industry Taskforce that Joe's mentioned. It's just great to have that opportunity to collaborate with other industry professionals, policymakers, to work on tackling some of those challenges in the onshore wind space. And I think it's quite clear that the Labour government came in with a plan and quickly demonstrated that sort of strong and positive vision for onshore wind across the UK, and moving swiftly to remove the ban that had been in place for a decade in England, and that commitment to accelerating renewable energy deployment across the UK, not just onshore wind, that's offshore wind and solar as well. It does send a really strong signal to investors like RWE. I won't talk about the barriers because Joe's mentioned all of them in quite a lot of detail already. But many of the initiatives have, although the task force hasn't concluded yet, a lot of the initiatives have already been announced by the UK government, such as the consultation on amendments to the National Planning Policy Framework, and a consultation on bringing onshore wind back into the DCO regime for the nationally significant infrastructure project, as well as the consultation on Eskdale-Muir, which is potentially going to unlock a lot of capacity in Scotland. And it is quite clear, it always has been, that Scotland will do that heavy lifting in terms of 2030 targets. That's where most of the pipeline, that mature pipeline, is. But there is also a smaller pipeline coming through in Wales, which is reaching that maturity level now. It's a bit behind Scotland. But there's also, there's not a massive pipeline in England, but there are a few projects being announced, which demonstrates that renewed confidence, and also demonstrates that developers have been working on some of these projects in advance of the change of government in the summer. But the key objective, I guess, is to provide that favourable environment for onshore wind to thrive and contribute significantly to the UK's Clean Power 2030 plan, as well as beyond. It's important not to sort of reach that and then stop. We need to keep going with that acceleration, because it's not going to be enough, I guess.
Lovely, thank you, Larry. Yeah, the sort of political will and momentum. It's really exciting to see that happening in the sector. Rebecca.
Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca Windermer. I head up our work on planning and communities at Regen. So a couple of reflections from me. Firstly, I think bringing people with us is absolutely key. I think there is a recognition of that, both at the government level, but also from developers. From the developers I've spoken to, there is a lot of kind of understanding of the need to do really good engagement with local communities, to understand how they want to be involved in and benefit from onshore wind projects. So I think keeping that good relationship with communities will be key, and linked to that, supporting the growth of the community energy sector and enabling more communities to start developing their own onshore wind turbine projects, building upon examples like the Ambition Lawrence Western turbine in Bristol. Secondly, getting the planning system right is absolutely essential, and a key thing there for me is addressing resourcing, making sure that we have enough planners, but also that we have planners who are kind of skilled and ready to be able to assess new onshore wind applications and also to assess repowering applications. And that links to the kind of third key thing for me, which is getting ready for repowering. We did a bit of analysis here at Regen, and we think there should be about 150 sites repowering between now and 2030. So making sure that we've got the policies and the decision makers ready for those applications.
Lovely, some good points there. Thank you, Rebecca. So now we've got a number of questions that are coming from everyone on the call. And I think, Rebecca, you touched on the one that's floated to the top, which is from John at CEE. And I think the point that you were making about sort of community development and ownership and what is the role for community energy in this sector? It'd be good to get some thoughts from the panel about yeah, what they see that potential being around potentially shared ownership or community benefit. What's the sense from the industry at the moment?
Shall I kick us off? I think, yeah, firstly, I'll touch upon kind of community-owned projects. I think there is a real need now for us to be able to support the community energy sector to bring forward their own community-owned projects. Obviously, this hasn't been done much over the past few years, so there is a need for kind of additional support to those community groups who are enthusiastic and who really want to have a turbine located close to them and to make sure that their community is directly benefiting from that. And I think there's things that can be done, for example, local authorities providing free pre-application advice to community energy groups who want to submit a planning application, increase support for community groups through the new kind of GB Energy and local power plan. So I think there's kind of key opportunities there for us to start helping communities to be able to develop their own projects.
Lovely. Joe, is this popped up a lot in the task force where you definitely mentioned it earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you have such a focus on the big numbers, the importance of kind of community energy projects and local energy projects can sometimes get a little bit lost. But as Rebecca said, I think actually that's a really important part of taking people with us on this journey, is giving people a stake and allowing them to participate in that transition to a decarbonised power grid. And it's certainly not lost on our ministers, who are very much in favour of community energy and in giving local people you know, that opportunity to participate and benefit from onshore wind projects in their local area. So yeah, it's cropped up in a number of ways. I mean, first of all, on the kind of community benefit side of things, you know, not only is this sometimes I think perhaps an overconception of community benefits as a bit of a silver bullet to resolving objections in the planning system, which of course, given its immateriality, is I think a slight misnomer. But I think there's a real recognition, given that the high standards that the onshore wind sector has set on community benefits over the last decade or so, particularly in Scotland, there's a real opportunity to capture that private investment and turn it into something real and very, very tangible for communities. And hopefully our update to the community benefits protocol can help to achieve that. And I'm sure there's more work to be done on that as we progress. So that's certainly something that the task force is looking at. Then, of course, there's the community energy side of things. As I said, I think there's a number of kind of key areas that have been raised here. I won't touch on the grid, because I think resolving the grid resolves, you know, it suits all projects. And I don't think that's necessarily a community-specific issue, although noted that community energy projects are perhaps more likely to connect to the distribution network than the transmission network system, and so there's perhaps some specifics there. But nevertheless, I think issues with grid connections are universal. But it's the planning side of things is certainly somewhere where it's been raised. There is something perhaps on permitted development rights, so we might want to look into that. But nevertheless, I think there's kind of improvements in the planning system in terms of engagement and guidance, particularly between statutory consultees and the people doing the development, and the improvement of information there can benefit. And then there's quite a lot on the kind of finances side of things. And I think there's some points raised in the chat around the insurance. There's other aspects about kind of securing investment and low cost finance for community energy projects that are substantial barriers to communities bringing them forward. So we're very much aware of the concerns and trying to kind of work towards a solution on those across the board. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Joe. I think it's come up a couple of times. There seems to be quite a big tension between the sort of in the economics between the size of the turbine and the potential to get it through like planning. Has that propped up at all, Larry, from a developer's perspective at RWE? It's what's your view on, do we need lots of smaller turbines in England, or are we able to get the bigger ones in, do you think?
I think the same as, we need to look at across the board in terms of the technology and the scale of that technology as well. I think there's a role for all scales of energy and all types of renewable energy to play in that transition. I can't really comment on the costs because I don't develop community projects, but yeah, economies of scale and everything that Paul mentioned earlier must be a factor. But in terms of, I guess, going back, so on the community benefits and community ownership side, we have mentioned that already. They're actually both quite standard offerings in Scotland and Wales already. So there's a lot to learn, I think, from what's happening in other parts of the UK. But they're not a silver bullet. And I think with the best will of the world, it doesn't matter what you offer. There are some people who will never support your project because they are fundamentally opposed. But I agree, on the community engagement side, the more you do, the more you can get through to people and try and bring them on that journey. And I think that needs to come from the government level as well, that national conversation around the need for renewables and the need for new infrastructure. I think it hasn't helped having 10 years of a government that's been opposed to onshore wind. That sort of filtered down into the local level. And if you've got skepticism at the kind of Westminster around the technology, it does typically filter down to people because there's that sort of trust element with the government. So I think that national conversation is really a big part of the solution.
Lovely. Paul and Harriet, did you have any thoughts about this? Paul, you were certainly raising the scale question in your presentation, but it sounds like there is potential for all scales.
Yeah, one of the main things I was raising, I mean, obviously there is potential for all scales, but the availability of turbines at the sort of smaller end of the market is reducing. Even this year, Enercon stopped selling. They're very popular Enercon turbines in that sort of 1, 2, 3 turbine market, and they had their E70 and E82 turbines, which were very popular across the UK, and they sort of nicely fitted into that 100 metre to tip sort of category. They're no longer available now as of the end of this year, and increasingly availability of smaller turbines is a problem, and I can just see that in the English context that will be a bit of a struggle. I mean, if you look at landscape capacity studies that have been carried out by the councils, way back in sort of late 2000s, early 2010s, they all categorize 100 meters plus as very large wind turbines. So now, if you're going to, as a developer, you're going to approach that council and say, I want to develop a couple of 150, 180 meter turbines. They don't really fit within that existing policy framework either. And so that's something else we probably need to consider moving forward.
Sounds like there's a great opportunity for British manufacturing perhaps to come in.
Well, that's
fill
true.
That small turbine gap.
Yes.
Add that to the supply chain working group. Harriet.
I think that not a huge amount to add to what everybody said. I think I would echo what Hilaria said, actually, that in my experience, developers are really keen to engage with the community, and onshore wind has been particularly good in that, and that plays a really important role in changing the narrative in relation to renewables generally, because what you tend to see is where people have got the wind turbines, they're really, really pleased to have them and they can see the benefits. So I feel it's a really important part of just changing our narrative, full stop, to be honest.
And more now, yes, I think Larry made the point as well about Wales and Scotland, so that there has been a hiatus in England, of course, but there's been a lot going on in those nations
I think that's
for the last 10 years, and a lot to learn and build on from those places. I might take us on to discuss a little bit more about local authorities. I mean, Paul picked up his point about what they sort of permitted about 10 years ago. There was a question about whether it's valuable for local authorities to do this sort of scoping at their sort of local plan level about where they would accept wind, or where they would welcome wind applications. What's the view on the how valuable that is, or is that a bit constraining for developers to have sites identified by local authorities?
I mean, I think from my point of view, it depends how it's done to some extent. You know, there are examples of both approaches in terms of having a robust sort of policy approach, which directs people to good sites versus actual zoning. In general, at least recently, some of the zoning exercises we've seen, I would say, have overly constrained. And that's really what we don't want to get to. You know, if you've effectively limiting, you know, within a local planning authority area, you know, down to 1 or 2 small locations where you can potentially install wind, and they only have to have missed a constraint doing that exercise, and actually they're not, you know, you can't proceed with those sites for one reason or other because of radar issues or something that's been missed as part of that zoning exercise. Yeah, we definitely don't want to be overly constrained. However, I have seen a couple where there's been quite wide areas that have been zoned in general, and then they kind of invite you to look within that, and I think that's possibly a better approach if it's needed at all.
Ellery, were you?
Oh, sorry, I butted in there. Sorry, Paul.
No. Good.
I guess there's a kind of point around the capacity of local authorities as well. I think at the moment we're really struggling to, local authorities are really struggling to keep up with the volume of applications they have to deal with. And it's not just onshore wind, it's all types of developments. And that is a real strain on local authorities. So actually putting an additional burden on them to update their local plans to assess areas as suitable for onshore wind might not be the best use of their time, as it were. And actually a criteria-based policy, as we have in Scotland, probably works better than some of the spatial planning that's happened in Wales over the last few years. I think that sort of criteria-based approach just allows you to balance all the environmental impacts against the benefits of a scheme, and I think fundamentally it works better. But there's a lot of learning, as I say, to be done from it. There's no need to reinvent the wheel with a lot of this stuff. I think you can look to what's happening in Scotland in particular to see that good practice and how it's evolved over time, and take as much of that on board as possible.
Rebecca, I know we've been doing some thinking about local plans and renewable allocations. Where are England's local authorities at the moment?
Yeah, the work we've been doing at Regen at the moment is looking at the links between local area energy plans and local spatial plans. And at the moment, there being a bit of disconnect between the local area energy plan work and then the local plan, particularly because updating a local plan takes such a long time that you may have the results of your energy studies, but then you can't quickly update your planning policies. And I think that's where I would agree that these criteria-based policies, if they're kind of worded well to make sure kind of we're situating wind farms in the best locations, can be more effective, because then developers can come forward with the kind of detailed information and undertake their own kind of site assessments and kind of bring forward sites that are viable and suitably located.
Yeah, and I think we have a note here about the sort of resource in those planning and permitting bodies that are sort of struggling to keep up. That's something that we've been pushing on. Joe, I see you nodding away. Is this more guidance?
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, this is one of those in theory versus reality points. In theory, yes, you know, the local authority is perfectly placed to identify suitable sites for onshore wind in a way that allows for streamlined permitting, right? I mean, you know, walking back to that problem statement, you have a lack of consensus on what a suitable site for onshore wind is. You know, for developers, they're looking primarily at wind speeds, you know, load factor, access to grid, and possibly land costs as those that determine site financial viability. For others, they're looking more at kind of constraints, and they're looking at kind of landscape and visual receptors, proximity to protected landscapes, impacts on heritage and tourism, or you know, substantial you know, conurbations. And this plays out in the planning system, doesn't it? Because you submit your planning application, and then it's only later in the planning system where someone says, actually, we need you to go back and conduct this piece of site surveying in order to provide that extra, you know, couple of months of bird data, or that extra little, you know, or you know, an extra piece of landscape and visual assessment or visualization or what have you. And this kind of leads to that planning in perpetuity. And this is somewhat linked to the size of the turbines as well, because you go back and do that, you've then got to resubmit your planning application. The turbine models that you originally submitted are now off the market, so you've got to resubmit with larger ones. That triggers additional stuff. You can spend years in planning doing that. So resolving this is really important. And, if you're able to bring together the right people with the local planning authorities to kind of share that information, share that data, and get areas designated, then that's fine. In reality, local authorities don't have the capacity at the moment to undertake that, and they don't have the skills and expertise to do so. And also, you've got to remember that for the best will in the world, all of that high level data that you put together looks good until you get on the ground and survey it and realize that actually, due to some anomalies, the wind speeds don't look the same way that they did, or the ground is not supportive of the kind of depth of foundation that you might need. So there needs to be a balance, I think, between the two, or a kind of bit of a compromise in the meantime, which is trying to use some kind of soft power in that space to try and bring the right people together, and trying to kind of create, as you say, these kind of more broader search zones within which we can then go in and have those conversations. So I think that's probably the solution. It's probably somewhere in between.
Definitely. We're working with quite a lot of local authorities at the moment on net zero living. So it's definitely an area that we're hoping to look at a bit more next year.
I must say I feel for local authorities, because they're often the answer in this and the problem. So, and I think, if you look at statistics from, of public sector employees, the profession that has suffered the most in the last 10 years is the planning profession. So they're being asked to do a lot more on a lot smaller budgets, and as much support that we can give them as possible is required if this is going to function properly. So it's certainly at front of mind for us, and I know it is for my colleagues in the planning department as well.
There's just a question that popped up where, as I'm scrolling through, about why can't local authorities put through an amendment to their local plan without having to redo their plan? What's the barrier to putting in a sort of an amendment or a quick additional document versus updating your local plan? I'm probably asking Rebecca that question.
I would say probably one of the biggest challenges for doing that is resourcing within the local planning authority. Like, the local planning authorities are so overstretched at the moment that kind of being able to go through that process of writing a new policy, getting that kind of checked legally and making it so it could then go into an updated local plan. I think we don't really have a kind of quick process in place for being able to do that, from my understanding.
So even these sort of supplementary documents and things like that are hard to achieve.
Or supplementary planning documents then don't have the same legal weight in planning as the local plan document would. So that's where it becomes quite difficult. And that's also why back with the previous onshore wind policy, where local authorities were asked to identify areas for onshore wind, it either took local authorities a really long time to be able to do it, or most of them chose not to do it, because it's just not an easy process to update a planning policy.
I'd probably add to that, if I may, just in terms of, I think that leadership in terms of policy needs to come from the top. So obviously the consultations come through on the NPPF. Personally, I don't feel it goes quite far enough if you compare it to the policy in place in Scotland under National Planning Framework 4 or the NPSs. So I think that we need to look at the wording and make sure it's actually providing that strong policy support for renewables. And there's also the national policy statements has that critical national priority status, which gives that sort of enhanced weight to projects in the NSIP process, where setting the threshold for NSIP at 50 megawatts to align with other technologies is probably what I would favour. I don't see why you would set different thresholds for different technologies. It doesn't really make all that much sense. But we do need that strong policy support, and if it comes from the top, then it's unambiguous when it's is applied by local authorities as well.
Great, thank you, Larry. I wonder whether it's, I mean, it's the thing that we haven't talked about yet is the network and the grid capacity for all these opportunities. You got Ian nodding away there from Keel's side of things. Where are we on network? I mean, I think there was an interesting point about the shared sites, so the sort of solar and wind sites that I've always thought was a potential opportunity if they've already got a connection, but that's not as easy as it might first seem. What's the current status on that?
So I don't mind starting here. I think everybody probably is aware there's been quite a lot of work done on the grid and connections, and we're moving to a new system in January of first come, first ready, as opposed to a system of people being able to hold on to those grid connections. So some projects have already voluntarily exited without penalties, the grid, freeing up a bit of capacity, and then milestones are being put in place, which I think clearly that will help a queue system, and you'll move within your gate. And we've heard a bit about NESO, NESO 30, and there's in addition to a project having to have its planning and its land agreements, it's going to have to align, we think, at the moment with NESO 30. But all of that is helpful. But what it doesn't do is put new infrastructure in the ground, and the biggest constraints are quite localized and just need upgrading generally. And I think part of the problem which people talk about is people objecting to, for example, let's say wind turbines or battery projects, because they're worried they're going to burst into flames any minute. Is people really object to pylons, and we've got a problem, haven't we, in relation to being able to upgrade the grid, not just putting the technology in place, because you've got a whole secondary set of local objections on top of the technology itself, and you can't upgrade the grid without going through planning, without some perhaps better national leadership on that. And I think maybe Joe's got something to add on that, because I think there's some positive noises, but actually it's a huge investment that needs to be made on the grid itself.
Well, I can't add too much on national leadership. I'll have to leave that to my ministers, who I suppose technically aren't my bosses. So there's only so much I can tell them. No, like, and we've known this for some time, the grid is the kind of primary barrier to achieving 2030 decarbonisation. And I think NESO have sketched that out, and the department is aware of it. I can't speak to a lot of the technical details. The way that the department is structured is that there's a separate kind of grids and networks teams. They're the experts. They're the ones who hold the kind of relationships with Ofgem and NESO and other relevant kind of network organisations. But I think it's fair to say that an appreciation of those barriers is well held in those teams, and that they're working kind of flat out at the moment to kind of come up with solutions that work in the near, medium and long term. And those barriers are clear, aren't they? Harriet, you alluded to it. There's an absolutely gargantuan connection queue. I think NESO data indicates that we could probably achieve our decarbonisation goals twice if everything connected. So managing that queue is vital in the near term. Yeah, in the medium term, it's about building the infrastructure, and I know that there's work underway to try and make sure that we get that in the ground. And then, of course, in the longer term, it's about that kind of spatial prioritisation as well, which the kind of strategic spatial energy plan is looking to do. And there's other bits and bobs as well. There's kind of grid charging, of course, and perhaps other kind of more thorny issues. So yeah, it's well appreciated. It's probably the number one priority. On that kind of community side of things, it's so intimately linked to the deployment of onshore wind, I think, and the kind of acceptance of renewable energy infrastructure. Colleagues I know are working really hard on a kind of community engagement and community benefits policy that kind of works well there. But again, I think in general this speaks to, I don't think those things can be silver bullets. I think this is a slightly more difficult problem to grasp. It's about kind of messaging and trust and all sorts of other things. I think a lot of rural communities have not seen a huge amount of investment in their services for quite some time. I know where I grew up in mid Wales, the sixth forms closed, both the banks on the high streets have closed, the swimming pools closed, police stations closed. I could go on. And so, until these communities feel like they're being invested in and that they're being kind of taken on their journey, they're going to have kind of stronger reactions to these things. So a lot of that is to do with messaging. And there's probably some things that government can do, but we're not always the trusted messenger. So there's also some things that we can all do, I think, to kind of, work to identify who those trusted messages are, make sure that information is kind of factual on both the benefits and the requirements of these technologies, but also naturally on what their impacts are. So that when you get to the discussions at the local level, they're more structured, they're more focused, and they're more efficient on the things that really matter, both to the communities and in terms of the kind of shape and size of the infrastructure that's being proposed. And I think that's a very difficult thing to do, and that comes with time. It helps having, I must say, even for myself, it helps having ministers who are outwardly positive about the kind of technology that I work for and represent. But that's only one thing. There's so many different aspects to it.
We've certainly got some good comments in the chat, and I think it's a good place to sort of end on, I guess, in terms of the wider economic benefits from a sort of revival of onshore wind in England, and the manufacturing job and skills opportunities that a sort of revitalised sector might provide across England and Wales and Scotland, which is one of the benefits of this sort of diversified electricity system.
Sorry, just to add on that point, I guess I can't remember what the stat is off the top of my head, but it's something like we need 4 times as much grid infrastructure built in the next 10 years as we've had built in the last 30. It's I can't remember. I probably got that completely wrong, but it's there or thereabouts. And we've touched on the regulatory side of that. So there's the change to the queue management system and trying to kind of accelerate the projects that are closer to being ready, which is a good thing fundamentally. You've got the consenting challenges, which apply to all infrastructure, but then you've also, as you've alluded to, got the skills and supply chain issue as well. And one of the issues that we're having with distribution network operators is that lead time on transformers, which is incredibly long, which means that even if you've got your project consented, you might be waiting quite a few years before you can connect it, because there's just such a demand for that essential piece of kit, I guess, to get your electricity away. So they're all interrelated, I guess, but they are all fundamental issues that we need to upskill, build up the supply chain in the UK so that the UK can benefit as much as possible from this, because if we don't upscale and we don't build up that supply chain, that'll have to be imported from somewhere else, which is obviously not the optimal sort of outcome for the UK.
So we've got a few moments left. I wonder if we could maybe just go around the panel to get your sort of closing thoughts on the revival of onshore wind in England. I might go to Ian because we haven't heard from you yet. If you could give us your conclusions.
It's going to be a hard job, I think, to get it done. But in my view, wind is the way forward. We've had great experience with our wind. I think that the network is a big issue. Planning is people, government can control, blah, blah, blah. You've got to get the network right. And there are lots of things out there that need to be done. And one is we've got a dumb network in the UK. Dumb as in it doesn't control properly, it doesn't understand where all the electricity is going. So that would be my drive to help onshore wind. And there are ways around this. Sorry.
Thanks, Ian. Rebecca?
Yeah, I think for my final statement, I'll just mention repowering, as we didn't get onto it in too much detail in this discussion, and just that it is going to be a huge opportunity coming up soon that we need to be ready for. And part of that will be looking at how we re-engage with communities and how there's opportunities for local people to really benefit through the repowering process. And I think at Regen, this is something we're going to be starting to look at more in the new year. So yeah, keep an eye out for that.
I mean, is there anything in particular that makes the repowering very, you know, it's the legacy that you've got from the previous site, I guess, that makes that a very different prospect to new sites?
Yeah, it's because most sites in the UK have been granted planning permission for 25 years with the condition then that they would be removed. So you're putting in a new planning application, normally for fewer turbines, but turbines that are going to be much larger. So you're kind of reassessing those impacts, new opportunities for things such as environmental improvements and community funds. And these are going to be kind of another new type of application for local authority planners to be trying to assess as well.
Yeah. Harriet, from your legal side.
So I think from the legal side actually is probably the simplest bit of this, to be honest. We know how to do it. We've done it a lot. And everything is in place, really ready to go. So I think it's interesting to say that 2 years ago there was a similar, is it going to happen? And I think, you know, the fact that we've had over 250 people on this webinar shows how keen people are to move it forward and interested they are in its revitalisation. I think what we need to make sure we do as an industry is capitalise on the momentum that we have got from a new government and try and really look at planning, grid, and yet definitely supply chain. Transformers are a real issue. Maybe we can persuade the National Wealth Fund to invest in some, they can start distributing them. But, you know, we've got a growth problem in this country, and we can really be part of the solution, but it takes a joined up approach.
Thanks, right. I'm going to go to Paul.
No, I agree wholeheartedly with that. I think overall it's very positive. We're seeing a big uptick in terms of potential clients talking to us about projects and how to take those projects forward. I agree with Rebecca. Repowering, I think, will be very exciting. We've done a number of repowers already in Wardle Armstrong, and where we have done, the communities have been very positive overall. I think there's a big difference between a community that's never had a wind farm nearby to one that has a wind farm and will just see a bigger one. I think that's not quite the same step change as going from nothing. So I think, you know, repowering is a great opportunity on top of that as well. But yeah, I think I'm very positive.
All good. Fantastic. Nice to keep optimistic. Ellery.
Yeah, I guess to sum up, one thing we didn't really touch on today was probably the contracts for difference scheme in much detail. So I think to get to 2030 targets, we need to align the CFD parameters and the budgets with what we require to be moving into kind of construction and into operation before 2030. So that's key. It's kind of like you've got your 3 pillars, which is planning, grid, route to market, that you need to make your project work. But I guess to sum up, I'm going to steal Harriet's phrase, which is nervously optimistic. I think there's optimism, but there's a lot of hurdles and barriers and stuff to get over.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to let Joe finish off.
Yeah, I'll build on that and say anxiously optimistic, given that all of the answers tend to lie with myself and my department. So I'll take them all away. No, I think it's very easy. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's very easy, I think, to get het up on the deliverability of a 2030 target and say, well, it's not going to be possible, and you know, et cetera. I'm sure that the target was set to be met, but I think the target was also set to catalyse the kind of conversations around radical reform that's genuinely needed for us to achieve that. And the battle will continue 2030 to 2035. That's when so much more of the electrification will occur. That's when so much more of the increase in demand will happen. So the work to 2030 and the 2030 target is about creating that radical reform and that policy environment that then supports that increase 2030, 2035 and beyond. So I think, you know, leaving grid aside, I think there's real scope and real appetite across government and elsewhere to really bring forward some of these changes, whether that's, you know, a stronger repowering policy and then twinning that with support in the CFD, you know, tick government looking at and committing to in various different forums, you know, whether that's a national wealth fund that supports the investment in the kinds of supply chain infrastructure that we're going to need, you know, whether that's working to secure radar solutions by, you know, increasing transparency and resourcing, you know, between airports and developers. So these are all areas that we need to be looking at, the government is looking at, but we're definitely reliant on getting those ideas from yourselves and good communications and you telling us what those barriers are. And I think there's really good lines of communication on that front. But the other thing I would also say is that we can't get too blinkered on build at all costs. And we do need to be mindful that ultimately these are large moving pieces of infrastructure in rural communities that haven't seen a huge amount of investment in infrastructure of any kind for some time. And therefore it's vital that we are mindful of that and we're managing that in a way that ensures that what we build now is sustainable, that those relationships we build now is sustainable. So that's particularly front of mind as well.
Thank you, Joe. That's a really good summary. And it just remains for me to say thank you so much to Joe, Harriet, Paul, Rebecca, Larry and Ian. And thank you, yes, for all your contributions and everybody for putting in some great questions. I'm afraid we didn't get to answer all of them. I think we did try and answer most of the themes, but perhaps not some of them directly. So we will have a review of that. And if we can help answer any of them directly after this, we will attempt to do so. So it's just for me to say thank you very much. I just have been told by Hannah to remind you that we have Green Energy Awards. So on a way of which are here you go, lots of categories, including developers. They're free to enter, and they're really great annual process to really celebrate some of the most outstanding people and organizations that are taking action on clean energy in various ways. So if you are able or think of projects that should apply to this, then please do. And thank you very much for coming. I will close that now.